Well, it's still dark, like my light is gonna go out shortly. But I can tell you one thing, that when you don't drink any alcohol, the first after effect is that you find that you have much more time, you know. I got up at 5 o'clock today because it's been a while since I did any of my kettlebell exercises because of my arm. And that happened, remember when I said I fell off the truck? That happened on July 10th. Now it's August 13th, and I'm still not 100%, but I'm 100% that it's not broken, that nothing is broken, because I can straighten my arm. But it does hurt a little bit, so I tried to do some kettlebell jerks this morning. Couldn't do it with the right hand, it was painful. But anyway, did some exercises, feeling good, and then I thought, wait a second. I'm here at Starbucks, and at 6 o'clock, my shift starts at 6:45. So I thought, hey, I have half an hour, and I've been behind on my 0 to 60 segments. But today I stopped by to get coffee, and they have all these, you know, young, beautiful women working there. And she gives me the coffee, and she says, what time do you get off work? We were just talking about shifts, you know, because I asked them, I said, you guys have to be here so early. What time do you have to get up? I'm just curious, right? And she says, well, I got up at 5, but she says people that open the store, that opens at 5:30, they have to be here at 5, so they have to get up at like 4:30. And then she says, what time do you get off work? And is she trying to invite Grandpa Sergei for a drink? I don't know. That would be nice. But yeah, of course, it never happens. It's only in movies, you know, when women are proactive. In real life, they're never proactive. But actually, I saw a YouTube video. A guy says he stops a beautiful girl on the street, and he says, I'll give you $10 if you get a phone number from any guy. Can you get a phone number from any guy? And she says, yeah, because she's like young and beautiful. And she gets a phone number from a guy. Yeah, you look, she starts with, I like your shirt. Hey, you look really cute. Can I get your number? Call me. But this was for money, right? So I like I said, in real life it doesn't happen. Anyway, so episode 7, we finished off last time in 1992, and this was the year where I finally, sorry, just checking if we are recording. This was the year where I finally was able to leave Ukraine and move to Russia, which was my, you know, lifelong dream at that moment. Because imagine, like, you're German and you're living in Italy, right? Because your dad serves at a NATO base in Italy, and then when he's discharged from the army, you settle down in Italy. You try to move to Germany, your parents don't want to do it, and then you try to do it yourself, and Germany says, we cannot let you come here unless you have an apartment or a house. Which sounds stupid, but that was the situation in Russia, right? Because they have these Stalin era super restrictive residency permit rules. Like, I can buy a ticket from Ukraine, you know, a train ticket, and go to Moscow, Russia, but it would be impossible to find a regular job unless you have a residency permit, propiska, which is a stamp in your passport. And again, passport was the only document that was recognized as an ID. Driver's licenses were not considered an ID, which is, again, it was funny for me, right, when I came to Canada and everybody's like, can I have your driver's license? Nobody cared about my passport. Well, I didn't have a Russian passport. Nobody cared about my Russian passport when I was in Canada, so everybody was asking for a driver's license. But anyway, so, and that was my situation, right? I was Russian with a military dad who, after he was retired, he stayed in Ukraine. They didn't want to leave, and I couldn't just go to Moscow by myself. But then I found this girl. Her mother she was not a Russian, but somehow she got her hooks, so to speak, into Moscow, and she said she would help us if we come together. And I kind of like this girl, you know, and so we were kind of like, you know, more like friends. And so she was coming from, I think, Ossetia, which is like next to Georgia back in the day there. And they were having some troubles there with these Chechen guys. You know, there was always kind of like a war between Chechens and Ossetians. And she was Russian, but she lived in Ossetia for some reason. And so we decided to help each other and kind of like cooperate our efforts and come to Moscow. And the only problem is, by that time, Ukraine, this is 1992, Ukraine already was an independent country. And it had its own money. Карбованец. Или гривна. Гривна, yeah, какой карбованец? Sorry. What? Карбованец, that was Ukrainian for ruble. No, they had гривна. Гривна. And they were like funny little money. But anyway, so that's the first thing a country does, right, when it becomes independent. And they were so proud that they have their own money, except all the factories closed. Like, I'm telling you, it was a disaster. I was laughing my head off because they wanted to be they wanted to be independent so badly, but because everything was integrated, you know, within the USSR, right, there were some chains, right, of supply and demand. And in particular, so we had 3 universities in Kirovograd where I was trying to escape from. So the aviation school, which was a university, like civil aviation school. Then we had Pedagogical Institute, which I went to study English. And then we had Agricultural Machinery Engineering School. And we had a couple of big plants. The biggest one was Сельхозфабрика, basically agricultural machinery factory. And that's where we had Agricultural Engineering School. Because they often hired those guys. So there was a huge plant called Krasnaya Zvezda, a red star. What else? It occupied, I don't know, 20 acres. No, I mean 20 hectares. 20 гектаров. Like, it was huge. And then also we had what else was there? We had Завод пишущих машинок. Believe it or not, we had a typewriter factory. Kirovograd. Завод пишущих, я не помню. I don't remember how it was in Ukrainian. And then we had a couple of big food-related factories. One was the sausage factory, and Ukrainians were always complaining how everything, like 90% of sausage they made, was going to Moscow, Russia. And then we had a big candy factory where they made super nice, actually fancy chocolate candies and chocolate itself. They were super popular in Russia, you know, and again, they were all going to Moscow, I'm guessing, for distribution. And so this hostility between Ukraine and Russia, you know, existed long time ago, ever since Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union. They didn't want to be a part of the Soviet Union, they wanted to be independent. And so there was always tensions, you know. More like because Moscow was kind of the center, right? It was the power, not just the Russia, but because, yeah, the central government, the federal government of the USSR was taking everything from Ukraine to distribute, you know, to other republics and stuff like that. But anyway, so that candy factory, because we had some very nice candies and chocolates at the store, so it gave me an idea, like, how do I move to Moscow? My parents gave me some money, and you know, I saved a little bit when I worked at that aviation school in the marketing department. So I was always bad at saving, but I think I had some money saved up, and so maybe I had like 200-300 rubles, you know, like bucks. And I knew that if I just, like, there was no rubles, right, unless I go to a local bank and try to exchange them. But I was pretty sure that I would take a bath, right, because you're trying to get rubles in Ukraine, so they're not gonna give you a good exchange rate. And then the same in Russia. If I go there with these hryvnia, you know, Ukrainian money, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna take a bath as well, because, you know, you in Russia, who wants Ukrainian money in Russia, right? And that was a logistics problem, which Captain Sergei successfully, or so I thought, solved. So I went to a store and I spent probably 150 rubles. I mean, hryvnias, whatever, but in rubles money. But I spent a lot, and I bought some really nice chocolate, you know, like bars and like in boxes, all sealed. And why I did that is because this was the beginning of capitalism. Like everywhere things were falling apart. You see, like Ukraine was already independent, right? So this was the time when small businesses were powering up everywhere in Russia. Like finally people were allowed to have private property. Like it was crazy, kind of like wild west capitalism style, you know. And so one of the interesting developments was that, of course, retail trade prospered everywhere. And by the way, when all the factories closed in Russia after they became independent because there was no work, most people, what they were doing is husband and wife would become traders. Not traitors, but traders, you know, like selling stuff. So the husband would go to Poland, across the border, usually it was Poland, and they would buy all kinds of, you know, clothes, food, whatever, and they would bring it back, and his wife would be at the market. We had these huge markets, and he would give her all this Polish and West style, you know, clothes and stuff, and she would be selling it. So everybody was selling. Everybody was like 99% of the population was in the selling game all of a sudden, you know. Like again, husband is the buyer and the wife is the seller on the retail level at the market. I mean, it was crazy times, you know. Again, all factories were closed, so the country, it was the feeling that's why I wanted to get out. I had the feeling that Ukraine was basically going down the drain, you know. And again, they told us, if you remember, I mentioned in the previous episode, I still had the Soviet Union passport, and Ukraine was already independent, right? It was Ukraine, country of Ukraine, and they kind of like gave us an ultimatum: either get the heck out or become a Ukrainian citizen, because your passport is no longer valid here. And so even if I wanted to stay, which I didn't have a choice pretty much, since I didn't want to become a Ukrainian citizen. And so yeah, so one of the developments was that everywhere in Russia, I knew this from my previous trips, right, to Russia. I've been in Moscow, like, you know, hundreds of times, especially when I worked on the railroad. So they had these, what they called in Russian, комиссионка, or loosely translated commission store, commission shop, which means that they would take your stuff and sell it on your behalf, and they would charge you a commission, right? Kind of like a pawn shop, or what is it, like, you know, stores here. Let's say you have some old clothes, or maybe you have some new clothes that you want to get rid of, you know, not exactly like Goodwill, but much better looking inside. It was like a real store. And so there was no control, no sanitary control, I don't think, but as long as, and so these guys would take anything. And of course, quite often people would give them some new stuff, you know, like somebody stole somewhere a television or something, or a radio set or something, and they had lots of these non-perishable food items like chocolates, candies, as long as they were in the proper packaging and all sealed. And that's what I had. I had a box of chocolate, you know, not just like one chocolate, but a sealed box of chocolates. And I think they opened the box just to make sure that inside it was all, but it was, you know, it all looked brand new. So I remember it was a kind of like, this was summer, right? So chocolate melts in the summer. So I don't remember exactly how I managed to keep it 1,000 kilometers. You know, it's like a 2-day trip from Ukraine to Moscow by train, but somehow it didn't melt. And so that's how I made my money. I think they sometimes, when they really wanted your stuff, the commission store would give you money up front, and I think I got like 80%. And so this was how I sorry, kind of like exchanged Ukrainian hryvnia, which I used to buy the chocolate. I kind of like exchanged it to rubles, right? Because in Moscow, of course, when they took these chocolates, they gave me rubles. And so then I met this girl over there, the one from Ossetia, and her mother helped us rent an apartment because they required a first month deposit, which I did not have. Like, I still remember one bedroom, or actually rather one studio apartment back in '92 was $500 US a month in Moscow, Russia. And this was not exactly next to the subway. Of course, we didn't have cars, so you had to take a bus to the subway, metro. And so this was not considered a good location, but it was a good new building, you know, like multi-story, 20-story building. But anyway, and so I was so impressed with the guy who rented us this apartment. You know, he was like an agent, right? So he came over, he had the one-page contract. Okay, sign here, give us $500. And then the owner was there, right? So the owner just took the money directly, but this guy just collected his commission, which was, you know, 1 month rent. And I said, hey, that's kind of like sounds interesting. I think I can do it. Can I talk to your boss? You know, because of course I was looking for a job. But actually this happened, yeah, it didn't happen right away, because I think first time we stayed at this girl's mom's place, and I was desperately looking for a job. Yeah, this was that real estate thing happened maybe a month after. But so I tried, you know, because I went to a bookkeeping school in Kirovograd at the end of my stay there. I tried to get a job as a bookkeeper, and actually I was approved. I still remember a furniture store hired me as a kind of like junior bookkeeper, but it was like 5,000 rubles a month, which was very low. It was, you know, hardly enough to, I wouldn't be able to pay rent, you know. And so they said I'm hired, but I didn't even go. On the next day I didn't go. And then another job I found was actually some Indian guy came to Moscow to open some export-import business, and he didn't speak Russian, so he needed a translator. And this one, I still remember, paid 10,000 rubles. What? So I remember I came home to this girl, her name was Helen. And they were kind of like jokingly, you know, poking at me like, okay, have you found a job yet? I said, yeah, I did. Okay, how much does it pay? I said, 10,000. And they're like, what? They couldn't believe it, because just 2 days ago I found something for 5,000. But I was super laser focused. You know, I'm a guy who, if I want something, I'm super focused. And so I worked for this guy, for this Indian guy, probably, I don't know, a month, couple of weeks. But then what happened is my dad died. This was again summer of '92. Like, a lot of things happened in '92. And this Indian guy didn't even wanna let me go, you know, like, what? You know, my father died, I have to be at the funeral, right? And so I flew to Russia, we buried the father. He was what, like 59, no, 57, this was '92, and he was born in '33, so you do the math. So he was very young, so had his he was a smoker, chain smoker all his life. He drank a lot when he was young. He had a lot of extra weight, and so had his third heart attack. And back then, of course, there was no phones, and ambulances was super slow. My mom had to run home. She explained to me, like, the attack happened when they were at the garage parking the car, and the garage was like 1 kilometer away from their apartment, and there's no cell phones, right? So she had to run home to call the ambulance, and by the time the ambulance arrived, he was already kind of like gone. But anyway, so I went back to Moscow after that, and didn't want to work for this idiot again, like this Indian guy. He was very annoying, you know. He was always arguing about, like, we would be in a taxi, right, and I had to translate for him. He would argue over every cent in a taxi, you know. And I remember I was apologizing to the driver. I said, I'm sorry, I just work for the guy, you know, but I'm sorry, he's so cheap, you know. And so yeah, after I came back from the funeral, I didn't bother with the Indian guy. But that's when my real estate career started. So her mother helped us. She provided the deposit, which is, you know, $500. So we cooperated, we pooled our resources, this Helen girl, me, and the mother, and we were able to rent with big difficulty this studio apartment, you know. And that's when I said, hey, I like this, you know. And so they hired me. I became an agent, and I remember, of course, I didn't have a car, so we were running around Moscow. Basically, we were just intermediaries, right? There was no licensing, nothing. We had like 4 or 5 guys sitting in an apartment that our boss rented, like an apartment. We had one phone, and we would answer the phone in turn. Okay, now it's your turn, you know. Like basically, all they had to do was they put an ad, classified ad in a Russian newspaper saying apartments wanted for rent, and then they would put pretty much in the same section, they would put ads, you know, apartments offered, but you know, kind of like a specific ad, you know, like a 2-bedroom apartment, you know, in the Yugo-Zapad, you know, southwest of Moscow, you know, like, and so yeah, you just did classified ads. And again, this was crazy economy, and somehow it worked. We didn't have any phones, any cell phones. Again, we just used subway to, of course, to go and do the viewing somewhere, you know, show people the apartment. We never saw them before, like, you know, there was no contracts, right? Like we never had a contract with the owner. We just, the people would call us, and they would call 10 other agencies, you know, and they say, hey, I have an apartment for rent. Okay. So they would just give us the details, you know, how much they want, you know, square footage and square meters, whatever, where it's located, floor, stuff like that, balcony, yes, no. And we would have a database on these apartments, and then the guys who wanted to rent would call in response to our other ad, right? And then we would go show them the apartment that we have never, 99 out of 100 we never seen before, you know. But that's how it was, you know, like you were selling something you never saw before. But hey, okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I did not see it, but yeah, it sounds like it's a 2-bedroom in a good location, 10 minutes away from a subway station by bus, you know. Our commission was 1 month rent. And then occasionally we would get English-speaking customers, right? Because it's Moscow, it's a huge city, and there would be some foreigners or expats coming, you know, to live and work in Moscow. And I discovered that, hold on, let me just check the time. Oh, 6:26. Okay, I still have like 5 minutes. And so I discovered that usually these guys would rent a much bigger apartments, and they would pay, you know, US dollars. But of course, as an agent, I was getting a share of the commission. I don't remember what it was, like 70%, 80%, 50%, I don't remember. But I remember it was, let's say if the customer pays us, you know, $1,000 commission for an apartment that was $1,000 a month. So it was just one-time fee. So I would get, I don't know, $350, $400, $500, something like that. But it was not very, not too much, not a lot of money. And so I was, you know, I like this real estate game. So I started thinking about, you know, maybe I should get into this myself, because, you know, again, I liked working with especially Americans who were coming a lot back then in Moscow, to Moscow. And they were opening, you know, let's say they were sent there to open like a rep office for their company, you know. Like I still remember one guy came, he was the manager of a Pioneer mutual fund, and he came to Russia to open a rep office, you know, like their agency. And he rented, this was one of my first kind of like independent jobs where I worked for myself. So he rented an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment in a nice area in southwest of Moscow. It was $2,000 US a month. So he gave me, the condition was that he would pay me $2,000 as a commission. And he didn't pay me right away. And of course, one thing with foreigners, as I would call them, right, was that, you know, Russians would, you show them the apartment, they would make a decision. Maybe they would see another one, maybe 2 or 3, but usually they would make a decision on the same day, very quickly. Americans, they would come see that apartment. They would never rent the first apartment they see. They want to see like 10 apartments, and then if they like something, they're gonna bring their friends or their girlfriends or their boss if it's an office, you know. So it took a very, very long time. You really needed to have patience when working with Americans compared to Russian customers. And so this guy basically sucked the blood out of me, and he didn't pay me when we signed the contract. We signed the contract. He signed the contract with the owner. Well, it was like, I found some legal contracts on the internet. And you know, that's what I was using, kind of like a also I had I created a contract that they would not what is called circumvent, you know, like not bypass me as a broker. And all these contracts had no legal force because they were all in English, you know, this is Russia. But Americans like that, you know, you sign something, you sign your name, everything is in English, printed out. So, but anyway, so yeah, I had my own little company. And so this guy, the next day, he calls me to his office and he says, yeah, like basically come tomorrow, I'll give you the $2,000. I was so nervous, I thought somebody would rob me, you know, but that was I still remember, I was so excited, I was jumping for joy when he did give me cash, $2,000 US. And so basically that was my real estate career. And then I switched to office space. I started doing the same kind of like middle, you know, kind of like brokering office space between Russians and Americans and French people and stuff like that. And at this time also my brother called me and he said, like, Ukraine was really dying, there's no work, you know, can I help him get to Moscow? And he came by train. I met him. He didn't even have, back then the subway cost 5 kopecks or 5 pennies. He didn't even have the 5 pennies to pay for the subway. And I said, you have some change? He says, no. So my suspicion was that when he was on the train, he didn't even have money to buy food, you know. So he came totally broke to Moscow. I found him an apartment, and then we started working together. But then, you know, my business was, all this rental business, it was up and down. So I said, I have to let you go. I'm sorry, I cannot pay you. And so, but he was answering the phone, you know, he was answering the phone. He was kind of like my office guy, and I was running around Moscow showing apartments and office space to, you know, usually Americans. And then eventually I got a cell phone when they just came. This was like, I forget, 93, 94. So yeah, that's what pretty much enabled me to come to Canada, is this real estate business. And then when I was showing one of the spaces, there was this British tourist, travel agency. They were looking for an office, and usually they would send a Russian girl from the office. They would send to first see the office, then if she likes it, then the boss would come over, right? Like, again, like Americans especially, they and Brits, they like to see the space or apartment, you know, 10 times before they would sign on the dotted line and give you the fee. And so this girl came over, and she's Russian, and we start speaking, and she says, what are you still doing here? I said, what do you mean? And she says, well, me and my sister, we moved into Canada. You know, until then I hardly knew where Canada was, and I had no intention of leaving Russia. But by this time the real estate business was really slowing down. It was harder and harder to get clients and to get properties, you know. Like real simple advertising did not work anymore, because I did the same thing like what my boss was doing with apartments when I just started, right? So there was a newspaper called Moscow Times, It's still there. If you Google MoscowTimes.com, it's still an English language newspaper published in Moscow by, I think most of the staff now is Russian, but it was in English. It had classified sections, so that's what I would put my ad. You know, apartments for rent or office space for rent, and I would put specific address for something. And then I was using Izvestia, the big Russian newspaper, and I would put a classified ad in Russian saying that иностранцы ищут квартиры, you know, foreigners are looking for apartments. And so these Russian babushkas would call me with the apartments and office space, and then the Americans and the French would call me through the Moscow Times ad, you know. But then by the time, as the time passed, this became harder and harder to make it work, you know. So marketing became much more difficult, and I was also getting very tired about the whole real estate thing. I wanted to do something new, and again, I had some money, but I didn't want to stay in Russia. I did not know what to do, and that's when I met these ladies. And what they did, they didn't speak very good English, so they wanted somebody to help them with the documentation, you know, with the paperwork. And so basically they said, why don't you go with us, you know? And so that's what I did. I applied at the Canadian Embassy. This was 95, I believe. I applied through the Canadian Embassy. Back then they had a point system where they would assign you points. You know, like there were categories that you had to pass in order to qualify. And you didn't even need to have a job offer in Canada. Like they looked at your age, they assigned you points based on your age. The younger the better. Then university education, I had that. Fluent English, I had that, right? And then the last condition was $5,000. You had to show that you have in a foreign bank, which actually at that time was illegal in Russia. You cannot have money in a foreign bank. But these guys say, well, we want to make sure that you survive, you know, the first time when you're in Canada. And so I did all that, and then there was a criminal check, background check, and you even had to do medical. They wanted to make sure that you don't have something like cholera or something, right? And you come to Canada and you kill half of the population. So anyway, it took 18 months, 18 months, 1.5 years. But then eventually I got a call or email from the embassy, and they invited me for an interview, which was kind of like the last step. And we did the interview. This was like a beautiful Russian girl, I still remember, fluent English, and she was, you know, employee of the Embassy of Canada in Moscow there. And then at the end she says, welcome to Canada. And they give me these humongous legal size, you know, government paper that says that now I'm a landed immigrant. I'm approved to be a landed immigrant of Canada. I don't know, it's kind of like a green card, but instead of being a card back then, it was like just a humongous piece of paper, you know, like, which was very inconvenient to carry. And so yeah, I still remember this was I think it was July 97. It was spring, because it was still cold. I was wearing my coat, and I leave the embassy, and of course they had a Canadian flag flying in the wind on a mast, and I look at it and I'm like, holy moly, you know, I was crying. I had tears in my eyes, because this was the first country that kind of like extended her hand to me and said welcome. Because if you remember, even Russia did not want me. Even though I was Russian, they would not allow me to move to Russia. And but somehow it worked, right? But again, it was a continuous resistance from the side of the authorities. Like Ukraine did not want me, right? Because I had the Soviet Union passport. And so Canada was the first country that said welcome, you know. And I remember, yeah, I did have to hire like a consultant a couple of times. There was a guy who actually moved to Canada and then went back to Russia to become kind of like advisor consultant for people who apply. I guess he found it was too difficult to make money here, but he was super helpful. He helped me with the application, because one of the key questions was your intended occupation in Canada, and it had to be something where you had experience in, and it had to be something that's on the approved list, because there were lists of it. So you needed to tell them that you're gonna work in that at that job, but it had to be on the list, you know. And so this guy, I think he charged like $100 an hour or something, but you know, it was totally worth it. So he gave me the list of all these intended occupations, and I was looking, and like teachers were not there, right? Because I had an education as a teacher. I said, okay, driver, but I didn't have even I never been a truck driver in Russia. But then I see interpreter. Wait a second, interpreter. Okay, so interpreter, I can do that because I did a couple of, you know, side jobs as an interpreter. Sorry, the sun is just over here. And I was doing some translation on the side, you know, and when I worked as a real estate agent, right, I was pretty much acting as an interpreter for my customers, and that's what I wrote: intended occupation in Canada, interpreter. And again, you didn't need to have a job offer, you just needed to have all your ducks in a row, assemble so many points, right? And that's when they said, you know, welcome to Canada. And then I booked a flight. Oh, and one more thing here, technically in Russia, we had two passports, you know, like we had a regular foreign passport, like a travel passport that you would need, let's say, if you wanted to go on vacation to and actually when I was making good money in real estate, I went to England, I went to Netherlands, I went to Switzerland, you know, I traveled all over the place. And you had the travel passport, right, like Russia Federation travel passport. But if you wanted to move to another country, you were supposed to start the very lengthy and difficult procedure of getting a kind of like an immigration passport. And then I discovered that nobody actually was doing that, because the authorities had very little control. Like, you know, let's say you're going to Sweden for a vacation with a regular passport, with a travel passport, and then, or you go there to live and work, like it's the same, you know. They will still allow you to enter Sweden with a passport, or Switzerland, you know. And so I found out that most people who were immigrating never actually told the authorities that they were leaving kind of like forever. And so I didn't even bother, you know, wasting my time with this immigration passport. I just booked a ticket. Actually, I still remember I was nervous. I went there, I went to the airline, you know, ticket office, and I said, yeah, I wanna buy a ticket to Canada. And all they asked me for, they said, we need to see a visa or something, you know, like how will you be able to enter Canada, right? Because even now, right, you need a visa from Canada to enter Russia, and from Russia to enter Canada. And so I showed them my landed immigrant thing, and that's all they wanted. So they sold me the ticket, and I landed in Montreal for some reason. Couldn't get the flight to Toronto, I don't think, but I wanted to be in Ontario because that's where all the jobs were. And in Montreal, when I landed, that's when I discovered, that's why it was called landed immigrant status. They stamp that visa thing, that big legal size letter, piece of paper, they stamp it, and that's when you become a landed immigrant, because you landed and now you officially have a residency permit. And this was August 18th, 1997. And that's the end of our episode 7. In episode 8, we'll talk about my first years in Canada, how I tried 1,000 occupations and finally became a truck driver. Thanks for watching.